Hello, Deacon Eric here. Well, when I'm recording this, yesterday was the feast day of Melchizedek. So if you look that up, you can figure out what day I'm recording this. But this should come out week and a half from when I record it. And so what I want to talk about, though, is Melchizedek. And I don't necessarily totally want to talk about Melchizedek. I want to talk about what Melchizedek means, right? And so it's a bit controversial for some reason, who is Melchizedek? But more importantly is, what are the implications of Melchizedek and the Melchizedek priesthood? So, personally, what I've always thought is that Melchizedek in the Old Testament was what's called a Christophany, where Christ shows up. And the reason is because I've grown up with a simple faith. And I read the book of Hebrews, and I've always thought, even before I was taught any other way, was that the New Testament is the revelation of what's in the Old Testament. However, most people, when it comes to certain things, for whatever reason, want to say, oh no, you need to read it. When you read the Old Testament, you got to read it in its original context. What did it mean to that original audience? Now that has importance. That's not bad. That's not a bad practice. It's not a wrong thing to do. It can help you understand certain parts of it. But the original audience in the Old Testament may or may not have gotten the full reality of what the thing is. Right? A prophet may have a vision, and he may see an immediate fulfillment in his lifetime. Does that mean that's the fullness of that passage? Does that mean that passage is done and dusted and you don't have to read it again? Well, no. Because otherwise, why read this at all? If that's all it means. But that's not all it means. And the New Testament tells us what we're supposed to do with the Old Testament sometimes. Because the way that Paul and Jesus and the apostles quote the Old Testament, and the patristic fathers, those closest to it, they sure aren't doing it in a historical, grammatical way. They're not going, here's the written. No, they're saying, you've heard it said, it was written this, but here before you is the fulfillment, Jesus says. You've read that, and you've always thought it meant this, but I'm telling you, this is what it means. Whoa. And so when it comes to Melchizedek, for whatever reason, though, people get weird about it. And the thing is, here's the reality. In the book of Hebrews, it does not come out and say that Melchizedek is Jesus. It doesn't. I'll admit that. But when you read it, it sure does sound like it. And you got to make it not say that. Right? And so when you get into Hebrews, there's several passages. In chapter 5, talking about every high priest. So we've gone through this journey in the book of Hebrews where Jesus is greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. And now it's going, his priesthood is greater than the Levitical priests. Which priesthood is it? The order of Melchizedek. Right? And it's quoting Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. So chapter 5. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Psalm 2. And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect. So Christ had to be made perfect? In one sense, yeah, because he was born into sinful flesh. He was born into a weak body. Right? And so this being made perfect, it's talking about his resurrection. He came in our weakness to destroy our weakness, to destroy death by death in order to be resurrected. And then to take a fully resurrected, a perfected human being into heaven. Locked it in. The ascension, which I talked about a couple weeks ago. And he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And some versions say, "of whom we have much to say." ESV says, "about this order of Melchizedek, we have much to say. And it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing." So I put it to you, did the church become dull of hearing when it comes to Melchizedek? Right? And we kind of don't like to talk about it. And now we got Mormons going, they're the order of Melchizedek. No, they're not. We are. We're in the order of Melchizedek. That's our priesthood. That's our eternal priesthood. And so then he rebukes the readers. You ought to be teachers, but you're not. You need milk because you don't practice discernment, because you're not acting mature. And so this order of Melchizedek is for the mature. Interesting. And at the end of chapter 6, so verse 13, "For when he made a promise to Abraham, since he had no greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves. In all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him." So it just rolls on in, and it's like this Melchizedek is the greater. Abraham submits to something greater, and it's Melchizedek. And so it says, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. So the greater blesses the lesser. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, where that is King of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling, it likes to say, these versions say, but like the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So Melchizedek's a priest forever? But I thought he was just a historical figure. So you get into Melchizedek and the vast majority of stuff, he's just a historical figure. We write it off. He's just a historical figure. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So if the scholars are right, this historical figure, he's just a historical figure. We don't know anything else about him. But the book of Hebrews says that he's superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men. But in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. It's still talking about Melchizedek. It ain't talking about Jesus yet. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of legal requirement concerning the bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law had made nothing perfect. It doesn't. That's not the point of the law. The point is not to make things perfect, but to reveal God's holiness and that you don't add up. And that you need a greater priest. That's what the book of Hebrews is saying. That the law of Moses was never meant to perfect you. It was only meant to reveal sin and reveal our lack. But to also protect, right? Galatians, protect that seed. Because he did pick a particular person, Abraham. He picked a particular people, the Israelites, to bring about into this reality, the priest. A better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it is not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord, or Yahweh, has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. That's quoting Psalm 110. This makes Jesus guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifice daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son, Psalm 2, who has been made perfect, Psalm 110. Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. So there's this heavenly tabernacle, right? So we read this. Now, then we go back and we read about Melchizedek. That's my challenge to you. Read the Old Testament, yes. But sometimes read the New Testament first, then go back and read the Old Testament. And let it reinterpret it. Let it give you a fuller revelation. Don't just go, well, what's the historical grammatical context? Do the historical grammatical part. Absolutely, because there's things in there. But what it meant to the original audience doesn't amount to a hill of beans to my eternal salvation. The historian can do that. And a lot of historians, they're going to read the Bible like it's any other ancient text. They're not going to see him. And there can be a value in that, and going, where do these talk to each other and what's the context? That's very interesting. There's things to get from it. Absolutely. But that's not how the Bible is written. The Bible is written to tell you, hey, I give you a greater revelation of what was. And then you go back and you read Melchizedek. And he's the first mention of the word priest. So he's the first, this idea of priesthood begins with Melchizedek. And he doesn't bring a sacrificial lamb. He brings out bread and wine. The communion, the Eucharist, he brings these out, and he blesses Abraham. And it talked about that, they have this, and Abraham gives him tithes. So the greater is blessing the lesser. Now, the Jewish way around this is to say that he's Shem. Well, if he's Shem, then he's not this Melchizedek in Hebrews, because Shem has a genealogy. It's in the Old Testament. And if you want to get into it, the Septuagint, the genealogy in the Septuagint and the genealogy in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew, are different. In the Septuagint, Shem is dead before Abraham is born. In the Masoretic text, which is a medieval copy of the Hebrew that comes later, Shem is alive and outlives Abraham. That's interesting. Because here's my theory. My theory is that the truth is being revealed, and Christ brings the fullness of the truth. And then the Judaism you have now is a reaction to that. The heresies of Gnosticism, they're reactions to the reality. But that reality was always there. So you got that. So you have this one little moment with Melchizedek where this mysterious thing is going on. But it's revealing the priesthood. It's revealing the elements of the communion. It's pointing to Christ. Fast forward, the next mention of Melchizedek is in Psalm 110. And Psalm 110 is this, David's having this encounter where Yahweh is talking to Adonai. Yahweh's talking to Yahweh right in front of him. And he's hearing this. And he says, I have sworn an oath and will not relent. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, interesting to note, with David, you track David's life, and David wants to bring the ark up to Jerusalem. right? They didn't have Jerusalem. He brings the ark up to Jerusalem, and he utterly fails. Totally fails. And what does he do? He reads his Bible and he goes, oh, the Levites are supposed to carry this thing. But then also he adds to it. Well, he got in trouble because he was doing it the wrong way. How's he adding stuff to it? How is he coming out dressed as a priest? Right? It says he's wearing an ephod like the Levites. So David's not dancing in his underwear. He's out in priestly robes, and that's what ticks his wife off. Because she thinks the king is greater than the priests. But he goes, no. Before the people I am the king, but before God I am not the king. But I am a priest. This new covenant priesthood has been revealed to David. And I challenge you, that's what Psalm 110 is a record of. I think in Psalm 110, he sees this heavenly priesthood. So if Moses sees the tabernacle and he says, we're going to build this, what is revealed to David is a greater revelation of the eternal priesthood, which is a priesthood of Melchizedek. So the priesthood of Melchizedek is the heavenly priesthood. If the Melchizedek priesthood is the heavenly priesthood, how is Melchizedek just some historical figure? I don't get it. Now here's the rub. I do get that there were weird Gnostic groups in those early centuries, the first century and second century, that they tried to make Jesus Melchizedek and then make him not divine, just an angelic figure. There's the rub, right? It's saying, oh, he's a created being. He's greater than us, but he's created. See, that's the problem. And so you have those groups, and I think the reaction to that is, well, we don't want to go there. It's just because they were wrong doesn't mean they get to own the revelation. Doesn't mean we just put it down. But because we're dull of hearing, we don't want to hear it. Now, if Melchizedek is a historical figure, and it's just symbolic and he's just a type, it doesn't fully matter because we're still called to this priesthood. That's what Hebrews is saying. You're still called to this priesthood. Either way. Now, it is interesting to note in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is it Q13 or Q113, the Melchizedek scroll, it has Melchizedek as this cosmic figure that's basically the Messiah, who's also a divine figure to come to save the world. So he's this divine priest, not just a historical figure. And so the context in Jesus' day, in the day of the writing of Hebrews, right, the historical grammatical context of the New Testament, this Melchizedek figure is not just a human king of an ancient Jerusalem. And I'll also say this. When it says king of Salem, it's always assumed, oh, that's just Jerusalem. Salem's just Jerusalem. Okay. Then how, after this, when Abraham takes Isaac to sacrifice him up to Mount Moriah, which is part of Mount Moriah is Zion, right? So Moriah is in those little, there's all these little peaks and valleys. Mount Moriah is there. That's Mount Moriah, where he takes Isaac. And there's wild rams there. And there's no city. There is no Jerusalem at the time of Abraham. It doesn't exist. It exists later. The Jebusite city is built later. It's built in that 400-year period when the Israelites are in Egypt. They come back from Egypt and there's these big cities. None of these big cities existed in the time of Abraham and the patriarchs. They existed after that. So how is Melchizedek the king of Jerusalem? No. Just because there's an Adonai-Zedek later, but this stuff's in the water there. There is no Jerusalem yet. But when you read the New Testament, this is a very Jewish writing. If I'm listening to a Jew say these things, he's like, I can't come out and tell you that Melchizedek's Jesus, but I'm telling you Melchizedek's Jesus because he's the greater. Abraham's the lesser. How is Jesus going to come into a priesthood that's not already his? It's his eternal priesthood. It's the same as he's also has an angelic name because he's ministering among the angels. He's ministering as the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament receives worship because he's not a normal angel. Just like Elohim just means spiritual being, but there's a capital E Elohim that ain't like the other Elohim. That's distinct. So I put it to you, because I've seen one things where well, Melchizedek's a type like the other types, but none of the other types, not David, Joshua, Joseph, nobody that's a Moses, none of the types of Christ in the Old Testament are talked about in the New Testament as if they were a Christophany. But Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews fits the bill. And we can go for whatever reason. But why I think there's opposition? First, there were heretical groups that used it wrong. Totally, I understand that. Also, the enemy is going to push against the deep reality of our priesthood. It's not, we have grown up with a pretty watered down gospel where it's just about getting saved and getting to heaven. No, whoever Melchizedek is, in the end it doesn't matter. What really, really, the deep point is that you are a priest forever. You have access and responsibility in heaven. You have access through prayer to be and act with the authority of heaven. That's the point. Whatever you might think about Melchizedek, you may think I'm totally full of hogwash. I don't care. Do you get the point, though? What we can agree on, biblically and theologically, is that the priesthood is for everyone in heaven, for all believers. Now, you might have orders of priesthood on the earth, just like you always did. Why? Because we're human and we need hierarchy. We need good leadership. And not everybody can be a leader. But that's not talking about in heaven. We all have access and responsibility to stand before the Lord, to minister to the Lord, and burn with the power, through the fire of the Holy Spirit. That's the point. That's the deep, deep point. And so whatever you might wrestle with and think about Melchizedek, I don't really care. What I really want to hone in on is that you are called to be a priest if you're a believer. And you can't, in the physical, always put that authority on others, but you can walk in that deep knowledge, even though humble. Like, my circumstances may not put me in authority over a lot of other people, but somebody's looking to you, to the lost. You sure are a priest. You are closer to the Lord. You are taking hold of your access, and they need the gospel. They need you desperately to be a minister of the gospel, to be one that knows their access to heaven, and to bring that access to them, to get over yourself, to die to self, and bring the gospel, to walk out this reality for the sake of others. Amen. Amen. And the Lord bless you and keep you. May He shine His face upon you. May He give you His shalom.